It's a real privilege to be here sharing during this Feinberg series. And for Bobby and myself, this is home turf, but I'm very thankful for the contributions we've had from John and from Brian and from Fred. Thank you very much for being here with us. And it's my privilege to share my paper, Christological Heresies in Light of Judaism, Ancient and Modern. And if you did not already get a copy of the paper, Delora is passing those out, so you can put your hand up. My goal for this paper is to bridge the divide, to explain all this Trinitarian talk that we've been doing. How does this actually apply in Jewish ministry? So I'm going to be diving into the field of comparative theology here, talking about how actually the Trinity and Trinitarian controversies in church history actually have a whole lot of importance when it comes to understanding Jewish people and Judaism. So let's begin with my introduction on theological retrieval. In recent years, Christian theologians have increasingly published on the need for theological retrieval. This term describes the process of re-examining and reaffirming traditional Christian doctrines, particularly those that have been neglected or marginalized over time. This endeavor draws upon the wisdom of the great theologians from church history, such as the early church fathers, the reformers, and other influential thinkers. The goal of theological retrieval is not to develop new doctrine or undermine the old, but rather to shore up important, already held beliefs that have receded into the background through contemporary neglect and unfamiliarity. Without retrieval, an important neglected but still believed belief may no longer be believed by subsequent generations, especially if the belief comes under strong criticism. This is the positive aspect of theological retrieval, re-articulating and reaffirming something that was classically affirmed in the past. But there is a negative or a defensive aspect to retrieval as well. Through theological retrieval, we may see that present-day objections to the gospel are merely contemporary remixes of bad arguments and heresies from long ago. We may learn about how to respond to the modern remix by seeing how our predecessors handled the original objections millennia ago. Solomon once said, "There is nothing new under the sun." Yet, without historical consciousness about what has come before, we may be left thinking that the present moment is more innovative than it actually is. Theological retrieval helps theologians reorient themselves and plan a course of action. I believe Jewish evangelism and apologetics benefits from theological retrieval as well. In this paper, I investigate 3 Jewish alternatives to the gospel through the lens of 3 ancient Christological heresies. I associate adoptionism with early Jewish mysticism, Arianism with Maimonidean rationalism, and contraction theology with Kabbalah. I seek to show that the contemporary Jewish missions movement may grow in its competency in Jewish evangelism through retrieving how Gentile Christians handled these heretical teachings in Gentile contexts millennia ago. So let's begin with our first connection here with adoptionism and early Jewish mysticism. According to Irenaeus, late 2nd century, John the Apostle, who he was only two generations removed from, John the Apostle once went to a bathhouse but noticed that Cerinthus was inside. "Let us flee," he said, "lest even the bathhouse collapse because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is in there." Irenaeus claims that John wrote his gospel in order to combat Cerinthus's Gnostic teachings, which included the following about Jesus. And now quoting Irenaeus. "He, that is Cerinthus, proposes Jesus not as having been born of a virgin, for this seemed impossible to him, but as having been born of the son of Joseph and Mary like all other men, and that he excelled over every person in justice, prudence, and wisdom. After his baptism, Christ descended on him in the shape of a dove from the authority that is above all things. Then he preached the unknown Father and worked wonders. But at the end, Christ again flew off from Jesus. Irenaeus continues, "The Lord's disciple, therefore, wished to put an end to all such tenets and to make firm the rule of truth in the church." Thus, John begins with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God." The reports on Cerinthus indicate that he syncretized with Platonic and early Gnostic ideas to derive his heretical Christology. Although the earliest reports do not mention Cerinthus' background, later heresiologists say that Cerinthus was Jewish and that he influenced the Christology of the Ebionites, an enigmatic Jewish Christian sect. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr speaks of some people, who are likely Jewish, who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but is a mere man. Trypho, Justin's Jewish disputant, says such a doctrine would be more consistent with Judaism. Likewise, Hippolytus refers to a late 2nd century teacher, Theodotus, who taught that Jesus received powers when the Christ descended upon him. Thus, we find that there was an early pressure coming from both Jewish and Gnostic quarters to define Jesus as a mere human who was exalted to divine Christ status by the Father, perhaps at his baptism. Modern scholarship calls this position adoptionism or dynamic monarchianism. God adopts worthy men to become a son of God and to receive divine honors, powers, and rank. In his landmark study on sonship in Judaism, Moshe Idel classifies at least 20 types of divine sonship found in Jewish sources. Did you know that, Feinberg students? Check out this book, Divine Sonship in Judaism. It's a big deal. Idel whittles down the predominant types into two categories, theophanic and apotheotic. Theophanic sonship refers to God himself appearing in the form of something, such as in a physical manifestation of fire or a human being. And you can think of examples in the Tanakh about those. Of this mode, Benjamin Sommer summarizes that a deity came down did not mean the deity did not also remain up. Idel rightly identifies theophany as the mode of the Hebrew scriptures' portrayal of divine visitation. Apotheotic sonship, in contradistinction, refers to a being ascending to heaven and being conferred the rank of Son of God by God himself. Idel notes that this mode of sonship is totally marginal from the Hebrew scriptures, but becomes prominent in Enochian and rabbinic literature. Apotheotic sonship is most pronounced in Sefer Hanoch, also known as 3rd Enoch, where Metatron is called the lesser tetragrammaton. In this text, Enoch ascends to heaven and is transformed into Metatron. God makes him prince over all created things, makes him omniscient, bestows his majesty upon him, and gives him a throne in heaven. Although such divinization is most emphasized in 3rd Enoch, the Hechalot literature of the rabbinic period and Kabbalistic thought also hold to the apotheotic goal for human beings. Through exemplary moral qualities and mystical practices, pious Jewish people may ascend on high and unite with the divine. Alan Brill notes that adoptionism became the standard Jewish position by accepting that a holy man can have the divine presence rest upon him. These ideas run counter to the New Testament and may be rebutted similarly to the way the early church handled adoptionism with regard to Jesus. First, it may be emphasized that God is one and his divinity may not be parceled out to others. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, says God in Isaiah 42:8. Irenaeus emphasizes that God's nature and attributes are united and whole and belong to him alone. There is no such thing as a being who is not omniscient at one time and subsequently made omniscient or is partially omniscient. No being that is not God may take on the attributes and roles that distinguish God as God. Second, as Irenaeus does in Against Heresies, and as Hurtado and Bauckham have done in our day, one may make the case that the followers of Jesus from the beginning have held to his unique and full deity, which neither was conferred upon him nor could be conferred upon him. He is divine by nature. In sum, retrieving the early church's response to adoptionism may be helpful for clarifying Trinitarian theology, but it also may have a side effect of bolstering one's evangelistic witness to present-day Jewish people, particularly those who hold to the classic Jewish position that man may be divinized through merit. Next, Arianism and Maimonides. Arianism, the 4th century heresy that embroiled the church, has striking similarities to the thought of Moses Maimonides, the 12th century Jewish philosopher. Arianism and Maimonideanism both emerged from Abrahamic religions that sought to integrate the latest trends in Greek philosophy. Maimonides was 800 years removed from Arius and knew nothing of Arianism, nor did he work from the New Testament while doing his theology. Yet, Maimonides and Arius shared similar conclusions because of their common Neoplatonic values and motivations. Both used Neoplatonic insights to define the mono of monotheism. They sought to preserve monotheism against perceived plurality and use metaphysical insights to shape their biblical hermeneutics. In the end, both concluded that it is impossible for the Son of God to be truly divine. Some decades before Arius's rise to controversy, the Greco-Roman philosopher Plotinus, who lived between 205 and 270, he had reshaped philosophical discourse through his all-encompassing vision of hierarchies streaming from an unknowable, indescribable, simple, ungenerated one at the top of all reality, even residing beyond existence itself. Only this absolutely simple singularity could truly be the source of all else. As the source and as absolute simplicity, no multiplicity could be found within it. Because it was beyond words and beyond conception, the only way to speak of it was silence. These ideas could be found in embryonic form in the earlier Greek philosophers, but Plotinus argued for them with systematic breadth and a certain charm. Origen and Novatian, both from the mid-3rd century, illustrate how attractive the Neoplatonic vision could be for Christian theologians in the mid-3rd century. Much has been written on Origen's Middle and Neoplatonism and the foundation stones that he laid for the later Arian controversies. Instead, I want to focus on the lesser-known work on the Trinity by the Roman presbyter Novatian. For Novatian, quote, "For whatever is simple does not admit of diversity within itself. Because there is no diversity inside Novatian's simple God, God can only be known through negating all positive truth claims, or better yet, through silence." Now, quoting Novatian, "Whatever can be thought about him is less than he. Whatever can be uttered about him will be less than he when compared with him. When we are silent, we can experience him to some extent, but we cannot express him in words as he really is." Thus, Scripture must give way to a series of Platonic theological moves. Novatian says God, quote, "never changes or transforms himself into other forms, lest through change he should appear to be also mortal." This calls into question Old Testament theophanies and the incarnation of the Son of God. He solves Old Testament theophanies through metaphor, just as he instructs New Testament interpreters to see only metaphors in its affirmations of God as love and light. Moreover, Novatian claims God's name is not what is revealed in Scripture, but rather is ineffable. For the first 8 chapters of On the Trinity, Novatian establishes his theology along Greek theological lines as just summarized. Then, in chapter 9, Novatian abruptly switches to a via positiva method of engaging the biblical text in order to defend the deity of Jesus, the Son of God, including in Old Testament theophanies. In Trinity, chapters 9 through 30, Novatian shows himself to be adept in handling the biblical text in this matter, providing an early Latin defense of high Christology. In his final chapter, that is chapter 31, Novatian finally reconciles the two strands of his thought, but in so doing, he undermines his stated belief in the Son's full deity. While the Son is rightly called God, Novatian argues, only the Father is without origin. The Son had his origin when the Father willed his birth. This willing did not happen in time, but before time. Nevertheless, Novatian says, quote, the Son must be less than the Father, for he knows that he is in the Father, having an origin since he is born. Notably, Novatian says the Son is like the Father, but did not, quote, take from the Father that which makes him one God. Novatian has now set the table for the controversy over homoousios versus homoiousios a century later. With these Platonic currents making headway in Christian theology in the 3rd century, it is no surprise that someone such as Arius soon arose to sharpen its force. In Rowan Williams' study of Arius's philosophy, he portrays Arius as a radical conservative who says almost nothing that had not been said before, but he presses his predecessors' claims to their radical logical conclusions. Arius envisions the Father as the unknowable, indescribable, simple, ungenerated origin found at the top of Plotinus' hierarchy. Plotinus insisted that this source of all could not communicate its essence to anything else. So too, for Arius, the Father cannot share his essence with the Son. It was a metaphysical impossibility. At best, the Son could be similar to the Father, an image of the Father, a derived analogy of the Father, but he could not have the same essence as the Father. According to Arius, the Father is invisible to the Son and unknown to the Son. The Son only knows the Father because of the similarity of nature the Father has imprinted upon him. The Son is one step lower in the hierarchy than the Father and serves merely as a conduit for the church to worship the Father. As the Arian hymn, the Thalia, went, we sing the Father's praises as without beginning because of the one who has a beginning. These controversies embroiled the church in the 4th century. And Nicaea pushed back against these Neoplatonic currents by rejecting ontological hierarchy in the Father, Son, Spirit relationship. In so doing, Nicaea argued that Plotinus and Arius were wrong about the metaphysics of the divine nature. Messianic Jewish theologian Mark Kinzer writes, quote, in rejecting Arianism, the Nicene Creed took a stand against the common philosophical notions of the day and for the biblical portrayal of the God of Israel. The Son is divine in the same sense as the Father. The persons differ on the level of personhood, but are united on the level of essence. This pushback to the Arians, delivered especially through Athanasius and the Cappadocian Fathers, served to buffer Christian theology from the usurping power of Neoplatonist thought. Judaism did not undergo a Neoplatonic phase in its theology in the 3rd and 4th centuries. The sages of the Talmud continued their theologizing apart from Platinian speculations. However, once the Islamic world rediscovered Plotinus in the Middle Ages, they fused him with Aristotle's rediscovered works. They discovered this philosophical synthesis, they delivered this philosophical synthesis to the Jewish authorities living within Islamic lands. And thus Judaism embarked on its own Neoplatonic encounter starting in the 11th century. Maimonides was at the head of the project of making Judaism compatible with the philosophical quest. However, Judaism had no successful equivalents of an Athanasius stemming the tide of Neoplatonic speculation to keep this theology of the Tanakh and the rabbinic sages intact. Instead, coming under the allure of Plotinus' metaphysics, Maimonides and Kabbalah each drank deep from the Neoplatonic well and reinterpreted all who came before. In his magisterial Guide to the Perplexed, Maimonides lays out a comprehensive rebuttal against any who would associate corporeal or metaphysical multiplicity to God. Like Arius before him, Maimonides appeals to Neoplatonic intuitions about oneness and hierarchy to define the highest one as the undefinable one. Let me read that again. To define the highest one as the undefinable one. Just as Plotinus, and as we have seen with Novatian as well, Maimonides recommends silence for all who would pursue theology. Quote, "For whatever we utter with the intention of extolling and of praising him contains something that cannot be applied to God and includes derogatory expressions. It is therefore more becoming to be silent and to be content with intellectual reflection, as has been recommended by men of the highest culture." But the parallels between Maimonides and the Neoplatonic tradition go ever deeper. So on this table here, I have the compatibility of Neoplatonic and Maimonidean doctrines. For those of you who really want to go deep in comparing these two, I'm just going to read the doctrines on the side, and you can do your lookups in Plotinus and Proclus's works, and also Maimonides on your own leisure. But on the side, you've got the doctrine: absolute divine transcendence, absolute aseity, absolute simplicity, no intellectual divisibility allowed, via negativa, the one is beyond all intellect, the one causes all, asymmetrical hierarchy of value based on the level of multiplicity, true wholes cannot have parts, and immutability, impassibility, and timelessness. All of these found together in Plotinus, Proclus, and Maimonides. Thus, Maimonides wields the Neoplatonic tradition as a weapon against those who would envision God otherwise. Although Maimonides' primary target in the guide appears to be Jewish corporealists, those who believe that God actually has a body in his eternal nature, the impossibility of the Trinity becomes a happy side effect for this Unitarian rabbi. Just as with Arius before him, Maimonides ends up with an unknowable highest deity who cannot have any second or third persons who share his essence. Maimonides' arguments are not original to himself, nor are they inherent to Judaism. Instead, they are inherent to Neoplatonism, and the Church Fathers provide significant resources to respond to Maimonides' Christian analog, Arius. Consequently, those engaged in Jewish ministry today would be well served to study topics such as the following for the purpose of responding to Maimonidean thought: Plotinus' six Aeneads and his principles of mereology, hierarchy, and causality, Platonic Church Fathers' allegorization of the Hebrew Bible, Athanasius' responses to Arianism, Gregory of Nyssa's response to Eunomius, and contemporary analytic theology debates on divine simplicity. Now let's go to the next and final connection here: contraction theology and Kabbalah. The Jewish mystical thought of Kabbalah can appear bewildering at first. Can anyone say an amen to that in this room? Yeah. Who had introduced you to all those crazy ideas? Yeah, I'm guilty of this. However, Kabbalah is a Jewish revision of minority philosophical positions that had previously arisen in Gentile circles and were largely dismissed by Christian theologians centuries prior. Thus, the study of these minority movements, such as Gnosticism, Neo-Pythagoreanism, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism, can assist in the comprehension of this uniquely Jewish mysticism. I seek to show that the study of early Christological heresies proves helpful as well. In the 16th century, Rabbi Isaac Luria solved a problem inherent in his Kabbalistic theology by positing a contraction of the divine essence, which he termed Tzimtzum. Right, Gary? Yes. In Kabbalah, God is the infinities of infinities, such that God takes up all the metaphorical space. His essence fills everything and leaves room for nothing else. How then can other things, such as physical matter and finite human beings, come into existence if the divine essence leaves no room for them? Luria envisions God as contracting his infinity to make room for the emergence of other things, while at the same time paradoxically saying that God's infinity remains fully intact even after the contraction. Although Luria was far removed from the early church, his idea of Tzimtzum has parallels with the theology of Marcellus of Ancyra, who died in 374. Marcellus taught that God is a singular, unknowable monad who expands his essence such that it comes forth as the Logos and becomes concentrated in the man Jesus. After Jesus' death, the divine essence contracts and God becomes a monad again. This is a quasi-Trinitarian appropriation of the Neoplatonic notion of the one emanating lower entities that then yearn for return back to the one. The 4th century church responded swiftly to Marcellus's novel contraction theology. Eusebius of Caesarea wrote a book against Marcellus, accusing him of making the divine nature mutable and material in its expansion and contraction. Eusebius wrote, "The divine nature alone exists and always exists unchangeably and in exactly the same way, being neither diminished, nor contracted, nor extended, nor expanded, nor having anything outside or inside itself, nor becoming one thing at one time and another thing at another, nor being one thing before and becoming something else afterward, and then again being restored to its former state." Arguments such as these resulted in official synodal condemnations of Marcellus's theology, such as in the Council of Sirmium in 351, which stated, quote, "If anyone affirms the essence of God to be dilated or contracted, let him be anathema. If anyone says that the dilated essence of God makes the Son, or shall term the Son the dilation of his essence, let him be anathema." Thus, the Son cannot be said to be an expansion or distillation of the divine essence, but rather he shares the full divine essence as a separate person in the Godhead. These 4th century Christological debates may be profitably applied to the Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum. God's essence is not liable to expansion or contraction. He cannot be more infinite at one time and then less infinite after some event. His essential qualities are immutable. Thus, the Kabbalistic notion of Tzimtzum is treating the divine nature as pliable and subject to change, which is opposed by many passages in the Hebrew Scriptures. Now I come to my conclusion. Old heretical Christology, contemporary Jewish theology. In his book, A Jewish Trinity, modern Orthodox scholar Alan Brill repeatedly frames Judaism as embracing theological patterns the early church had defined as heresy. Brill writes, quote, "Early Judaism and Christianity come from the same spiritual neighborhood of multi-level monotheism, but the difference is that Judaism chose the approach of a spiritual hierarchy, not a trinity. Judaism accepts what became known in Christian thought as the monarchist position, or more specifically, the form of monarchism called adoptionism. Judaism is monarchist. There is a hierarchy of divine parts, the Shekinah or Gevurah or Kavod. It's lower than the abstract God. The Shekinah and infinite divine are not indwelling together like the Trinity. Judaism's hierarchy is an emanation scheme. This is the Christian heresy of monarchianism. Implicitly, Brill is supporting the contention of this paper. One may learn more about Judaism by studying Christological heresies. When viewing the various Jewish theological movements through the lens of early Christological controversies, it becomes clear that similar theological and philosophical currents were at work in both religious traditions. When the Christian tradition went right on the basis of New Testament teaching, later Jewish tradition often went left. Christian theologians rejected adoptionism, Arianism, and contraction theology, whereas Jewish sources like Third Enoch, Maimonides, and Isaac Luria embraced Jewish versions of that which the church rejected. Over time, the theological gulf between Christianity and Judaism grew as further opposing decisions were baked into the respective theological traditions. In conclusion, the Christological heresies that captured the church's attention in the first 4 centuries have great import for Jewish evangelism and apologetics today. The Christological heresies of adoptionism, Arianism, and contraction theology, each of which were opposed by early church councils, live on in modified form in sources revered in contemporary Orthodox Judaism. Far from being irrelevant, the resources the early Gentile Christians supply against such heresies may serve as reservoirs for theological retrieval in Jewish ministry today. Thank you.